A controversial app that took photos of clothed women and stripped them naked may have been shut down, but it hasn't stopped versions of it from cropping up on the internet. The DeepNude app used artificial intelligence to create realistic-looking nude photos of women, and it was only women, it wasn't designed to work on men. After media attention was drawn to it, the developer pulled the plug, but not before it had been downloaded, shared, copied, and in some cases improved. This is the latest example of so-called deepfakes or synthetic media. You'll have heard about other ones that pretend to be global leaders and are getting better and better at faking their and mimicking them. Curtis Barnes is a legal researcher and an AI expert who co-authored a report on deepfakes for New Zealand's Law Foundation. Curtis, good morning.
Good morning, Kathryn.
I think the difference with this kind of deep fake is they don't move these images, do they? They are static, but they can be of pretty much anyone's image if their face is on the internet. Tell us a little more about what has happened with DeepNude.
So DeepNude is really the latest in a long line of technologies which are using artificial intelligence to produce better and better representations of humans in video or photograph or audio. Now, DeepNude in particular only produced photographs. The way it worked was that you'd essentially give a photograph to the DeepNude software, and using various artificial intelligence paradigms, it would reproduce a new photo in which it had stripped away clothes and inserted synthetic naked breasts and genitals. So obviously not the actual body of the woman in the photograph, but an artificial intelligence's attempt to recreate what it thought that woman's body would look like in that particular photo. And you could use it on men, of course, but you would end up with breasts and female genitalia. It just wasn't trained on photographs of naked men. In fact, it was trained on over 10,000 photographs of naked women. And
I think the app developer said that's because there's not many images of naked men on the internet. Is that correct?
I'm not sure that's true. I think there's plenty in mostly the same places he would have found the photos of women.
Correct.
It seems probably personal preference that, and perhaps a commercial decision, because of course they were trying to sell this app rather successfully, actually, for up to $50 a pop. And he made a decision that it would be better to go with women in that regard.
So he has now, stopped making the app after a response, but what has happened to the technology he's developed or the software he's developed?
Well, the DeepNude software was copied and essentially was made available open source on the internet. There's still copies out there, though some websites which had been hosting it were made aware of these and started taking them down. Nevertheless, the source code is out there and it can be reproduced. Because of the notoriety of DeepNude, it's become a popular place for cyber criminals to store malware, obviously because they know people who go looking for DeepNude are going to download it and may be trepidatious about revealing how they got certain viruses onto their computer systems. But it's not something you'd want to go looking for now, even though there are, I guess you could say, cracked, almost black market, if you wanted to use that term, versions available for download.
Well, there's a warning to you. You may pick up a virus of a virus of a kind you don't want if you go using this technology. That said, obviously very distressing and probably, as with so many of these things, an unresolved problem, including whether the technology gets to the point where you can be doing moving images. I imagine that's more difficult than it is in the case of the political leaders, which is the other use of the deep fakes we've been talking about, because there are so many video images of, I don't know, Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Theresa May that you would be able to utilise in developing an app. Is that going to be more difficult when you just want to use this as a method of revenge or a laugh on someone you know who's not famous?
It's certainly going to be more difficult to create a persuasive document because the applications require training data. Generally, the more training data you get and the better quality, the better output you're going to get at the end of it. But as the technology progresses, less and less training data is necessary to produce a better output. So what once might have taken 30 minutes of video might now take 10 minutes of video. And because it's not limited to simply video, you can also do audio, creating replica synthetic voices. What might have taken an hour might only take 20 minutes now.
So again, Curtis, we're left with the sense of inevitability around this being available, and the question then is what you do about it. The whole issue of how we can have functioning democracies, let's park that. It's been discussed previously and it'll be discussed in the future. But let's talk about the individual who is deeply distressed or wants to take action over something being done with their image. At the moment in law, do they have any kind of recourse? Do they have harassment law? Do they have any other kind of law? Could they be able to track down the person who has created and or shared this? Your report is wary of running too quickly to legal solutions, but are there some there now?
Well, for some context, when we began the work supported by the New Zealand Law Foundation, some people were saying that there was no law that was relevant, there was nothing law could do. We wanted to investigate that question, essentially. And what we found is in New Zealand, at least, and elsewhere as we observed, there was a lot of law which was clearly going to apply to various harmful uses and scenarios where these kinds of technologies were used maliciously. For instance, if you blackmail somebody with a photograph of them that's been synthetically generated, it's still going to be blackmail. It doesn't matter it was produced by DeepNude or if it was really taken or if you have no photograph at all. And if you slander them or harm their reputation or do harm to their company or things like that, this is all going to still apply. In New Zealand, we have the Harmful Digital Communications Act, which is not necessarily unique, but it's certainly an important piece of legislation that could help deal with this, in the sense that any communication which can cause harm to somebody, serious harm as assessed in the courts, could be found to be to cross a line and have a criminal response to it. We even have the Crimes Act, which deals with intimate visual recordings, so-called revenge pornography and things like that, which potentially could be relevant, depending on how it's interpreted.
How hard to find who's done this, though? In the case of revenge porn, you've probably got a prime suspect. But in other cases, how hard is it to track down who's done this and posted this?
It can be very difficult because you're dealing with a disparate system with many different actors. People download. There's someone who created the application that might be completely different to all the people whose photographs were used to train the data. Then someone uses the piece of software to cause harm to somebody, and there's open questions about, well, to what degree is the software's creator liable? How can we determine the chain of possession of a piece of synthetic media? So as with all areas of law relating to the internet, there's a lot of practical difficulties in enforcing them because so many people are involved in the process.
You warn against moving too quickly because, as with just about everything else to do with technology and the internet, there are many positive uses for the technology. It's those using them to break the law in other ways that are the problem. So what is your final conclusion on this one? What, if anything, should happen?
I think the solution is not going to be entirely technological. It's not going to be entirely legal. It's going to be a preponderance of a range of different things. There's people all over the world working for technological solutions. Policymakers are now starting to take this seriously at the highest levels. I've just been in Washington recently where they had a House Intelligence Committee hearing largely on this subject. And we even spoke to the New Zealand Justice Committee about some of its implications. People need to be aware that these things are going to be proliferating into their lives more and more, especially as we use the internet more and more. They need to be aware that engaging with them is wrong, and they need to be aware that there's a right amount of skepticism about what you encounter on the internet in terms of video and audio, and it's something less than refusing to believe the truth of any of it and something more than accepting it all. So really, it's going to be something which policymakers and the public all have to work together on in finding a solution. We think the New Zealand government has a range of different institutions within it that can work together to figure out which law applies where and who's going to enforce it.
Thank you very much, Curtis Barnes.